Welcome to our podcast. This is another recorded episode of Stay Classy San Diego, sponsored by MaxLux Media at maxluxmedia.com and Barntime Productions at barntimemusic.com, with your host being myself, Steve Wire, a freelance reporter. This podcast is dedicated to healthy dialogue around all things local policy in the North County San Diego area. Join us weekly as we interview political leaders, analysts, professionals, and community members on issues ranging from homelessness to housing density to elections. So in today's episode, we have two San Diego political scientists to discuss some of our upcoming elections and the ballot measures. We have Thad Kassler on the left. Thad is a professor of political science at UC San Diego, and he's the co-director of the Yankelevich Center at UCSD. He received his PhD from UC Berkeley in 2002, and his research interests include state politics, legislatures, legislative elections, and California politics. He has authored or co-authored several books, including Term Limits and Dismantling of State Legislative Professionalism. He is a recipient of the UC San Diego Academic Senate's Distinguished Teaching Award, the Faculty Mentor of the Year Award, and serves as a co-editor of the journal State Politics and Policy Quarterly. On the right, we have Carl Luna. Carl is a professor emeritus of political science at San Diego Mesa College and lectures on politics at the University of San Diego. In addition to teaching and research, Dr. Luna is a frequent commenter on politics, including on shows such as CBS Morning Show, Evening News, the BBC, Associated Press, and the Los Angeles Times. Dr. Luna has been a frequent contributor to the op-ed pages of the San Diego Union Tribune and is a contributing author to the anthology of presidential biographies, Public Pillars, Private Lives, and a revised volume on the presidency, Imperial Presidents, The Rise of Executive Power from Roosevelt to Obama. So we're going to get right into it. We have a few upcoming races that I want to discuss with you, but first of all, just this morning I was writing a story as that you know that about the upcoming upcoming election voter turnout, and so far the turnout seems relatively low statewide. We're at 11%, and I'm just curious to get both your takes sort of on if this is kind of what you expected for a midterm year, or what this tells us about the voting electorate and what this maybe who this helps or who this doesn't help.
Yeah, so midterm years are always lower turnout than presidential years, but we've seen sustained interest in American politics really since Donald Trump has entered the political stage, and so the 2018 midterm was not nearly as much drop-off as we've seen in other years. 2020 was a record-setting year. 2022, there still seems to be sustained interest. If you look at polls, there's enthusiasm on both sides, so I think it's far too early to declare this a low turnout election. Part of that is because even though we moved from Election Day, which is November 8th this year, to Election Month, which is really, once we get our ballots mailed out to us, it's the game is on for these campaigns. Most people really wait until the fourth quarter to get into that game, right? We don't turn in our ballot, whether that's dropping it off at a vote center, dropping it off in a drop box, sending it to a mail through the mail, or even casting a ballot in person. People do that really in the last week or so of the election period. So can't read in too much from these early low turnout figures.
Sure. Carl, did this number surprise you at all, or is this on course?
No, I agree with that. Midterm elections are kind of like, in the general election, you've got Beyonce and a bunch of warm-up acts, so people will sort through the warm-up act to get to the headliner. Here you've got just a bunch of warm-up acts and no headliner. It's harder to get people interested to vote. So midterms are always lower. I would anticipate the turnout in San Diego and California will be higher than a usual midterm. I don't think it'll be as high as you're seeing in some of the other states, maybe not as high as you saw in 2018, because California doesn't have as many, like driving issues. There's Prop 1 on abortion, which may be driving people out, but the statewide races, there's nothing really climactic that you're looking toward. And in the local races, a lot of them are just going to go the normal Democratic way. So that could probably not give us the same boost that you see, say, in Georgia, Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, where there's a lot on the table.
Sure. Well, in District 38, our 38th State Senate District, turnouts actually, as of just this morning, this is Monday, October 31st, was at 17%, so slightly higher for our area than for the rest of the state. And I wanted to talk about that race for a minute. So the 38th State Senate District, we have Catherine Blakespear, Mayor of Encinitas. She's also the chair of SANDAG. Running against Republican challenger Matt Gunderson. They're both vying to replace Pat Bates, the Republican incumbent who's termed out. So I want to talk to both of you about, based on your analysis, who you think sort of maybe has the edge in this race right now. Polling shows a relatively close race. I believe Blakespear released a poll that showed that they were within the margin for error with her and Gunderson. So I just want to start with you, Thad. Who do you think sort of has the edge? Does anybody have the edge? And who do you see has an advantage going to the election?
Well, in some ways, this is the Democrats and Catherine Blakespear's race to lose. This is a district where Democrats have a 6-point registration edge, right? And that's been the kind of edge that has insulated Democrats from any fluctuation over the last decade or so in national political tides with that kind of a lead. But this has also become the biggest battleground district in San Diego and one of the biggest state Senate battlegrounds all across the state. It's generated $11 million in spending, right? That looks like a U.S. Senate race in some states. So why is so much money pouring into this? And I think there are a couple factors. One is that neither of these politicians are really major known quantities. And this is, so Catherine Blakespear, okay, she's mayor, but mayor of a city this is a million resident district. And Encinitas is not San Diego. It's not a giant city. So she's introducing herself for the first time to many voters. So is her opponent. And that means you're going to have to spend money, and that also means no one has a built-in lead in this race, and that's partly just because of the way state Senate districts work now and the way term limits work in California. Nearly everyone who's running for the Senate isn't moving up from the state assembly; they're running for the Senate for the first time. But secondly, I'd love to hear Carl's take on this race and how it's going, and then maybe we can sort of move to kind of the big picture trends for where California's going, where North County, San Diego in particular, has been going, and see how the state might fit into it.
Carl, do you agree about Blakespear having the edge?
She's got the edge, but I'm surprised it's such a narrow edge right now. And one of the problems that I'm looking to see how the election matches with early polling, because around the country you've had the issue of undersampling Republicans, and this could be one of those races if Republicans are really turning out. This is a warning to Democrats for 2024. Republicans right down to the local level, where they've invested lots of money in building up local infrastructure and support to try to get candidates out, is actually starting to generate some wins. I mean, if that seat is lost by the Democrats, it is extremely significant compared to what you'd normally see in a state with just one seat flipping, since California and this area has, as Thad said, a 6-point Democratic advantage. Will they turn out to vote? When I think about Gunderson, I mean, first off, Blakespear has all the experience. She's even endorsed by the UT. Now, the UT has endorsed a whole bunch of Democratic candidates this time around. So, their editorial board has looked at a lot of Republicans running and said, that's going too far that we can support. Gunderson is, in my mind, my word for the day is squishy. He's one of the squishy MAGAs that have appeared for this election cycle. He's gone soft on abortion. He's talking soft on on climate. Election denialism, kind of like playing around with that. So he's not going the full MAGA because he wants to win. But the question is, will that code make it through to the Republican base to be able to elect him? I mean, he's acting a lot more moderate now than he seemed to be in the past.
So I do want to touch on that then, because you mentioned the abortion issue. Now, Blakespear has sort of made that the forefront of this race from her standpoint. Her advertising continually refers to Gunderson's, as you said, allegedly softer stance on the issue of abortion rights. For Gunderson, on his part, completely denies these allegations. He says he's pro-choice. He says that he's strongly pro-choice, and that Blakespear's trying to weaponize the issue. So I'm curious what both of you think, and I'll start with you, Thad, sort of this effort by Blakespear to position abortion rights as the centerpiece of the conversation. And what do you think of this as a strategy? Is this a good thing for her?
Absolutely, right? This is the Democratic playbook for 2022, and it's responding to the issue that the Democratic voter base and women all across the country care most about, and potentially probably the most consequential domestic policy change we've seen in our generation in American history. So what she's saying is she's a woman in politics. She's a staunch pro-choice supporter. Of course, she's going to talk first and most often about the biggest issue of the day. What did Gavin Newsom talk about at the beginning of the gubernatorial debate? It was this issue. What have we seen from Toni Atkins, who's appeared in our mailboxers and flyers? She's the legislative leader of the Democrats. It's all about abortion rights and Proposition 1. So Democrats are focusing first and foremost on an issue that they feel separates them in the mind of voters from Republicans broadly. And she's going to put Gunderson on the defensive on this issue and have him explain some ways in which he's pro-choice, some ways in which he's not, and he's going to risk alienating parts of his base with each of those answers. So is she weaponizing it? Yes. Is that absolutely the right way to talk about abortion politics today. For Democrats, yes, because it lets voters know that she's representing them on the key issue of the day.
Sure. Carl, do you agree with that this is an effective strategy for her?
I'm a bit more agnostic on it, I got to say, because while it is the huge issue of our time, in California, it's not that big an issue. Prop 1's going to pass by 70%, 65%, and you're going to enshrine it, in the state constitution, so it's off the table. And meanwhile, you drive, around and you see $5, $6, $7 at some station gasoline. That's a big issue that people are going to be talking about. The road congestion, homelessness, housing prices. The question is, how will the suburbs, and this is a suburban district, how are they breaking? And right now, my bet is they're going to break more Republican. Thus, Gunderson is doing way better than his track record and his resume should indicate he could do. I mean, I keep on waiting for progressive Democrats to say, you're progressive, own it. Who's responsible for high gas prices? The oil companies. 2 refineries on the West Coast. One's always down when the other one is doing some changeover. Go after that sort of things. That's the sort of thing you can distract the economy from while you build a plan to fix roads and everything else you have to do. I don't know if abortions alone is not going to get any candidate over the line. In a close race, you need that plus your second and third cut on the album.
Yeah, and I want to go back to you, Carl, immediately for some Gunderson's side of it is he's focused extensive amount of campaigning targeting Catherine Blakespear's record, both as mayor of Encinitas and as the chair of Sandag. Now, as I think you gentlemen are aware, Sandag's been faced with a couple of scandals recently related to an audit over their finances, improper use of employee credit cards, that sort of thing. And for her part, as mayor of Encinitas, she's been embroiled in a number of controversies recently with the city council taking power into its own hands on a number of issues such as housing development, that sort of thing. So what do you think about Gunderson sort of taking aim at Blakespear's record as sort of his ace card?
That's what you always do as the challenger. If the incumbent had a perfect record, why would anybody vote against them? Yeah. So you show, look, there were some problems at Sandag. And, in the scheme of things, this always reminds me of the old Calvin Coolidge joke that you got to do something about the small corruption because it's cutting into the big corruption. The stuff at Sandag was relatively small, but it doesn't look good. The problems in Encinitas dealing with housing haven't been fully resolved, doesn't look good. So he's going to hit that. He's hitting inflation. He's hitting the economy. He's hitting the issues that will make people who are not paying a lot of attention to the bigger issues say, yeah, maybe a change won't hurt. And on that squishy MAGA thing, it may cost him a little bit with his voters, but then again, I don't think it is because right now, on conservative social media, on conservative news, there's basically a message going out that don't worry about what they say. We know what everybody's going to do. All those congressmen running right now would say, I'd never vote for a national ban on abortion. Wait till they're in Congress. If Gunderson wins this seat, next step, run for Congress, and you can bet he will change what he'll be running on.
Sure. So with that, one of the other things I'll briefly mention is that Blakespear's been embroiled in a couple of local controversies, such as accused of censoring critics on social media and that sort of thing, and she's facing a lawsuit over that. Besides the housing issue, and when it comes to that and the Sandag allegations about the role that she may have played in sort of turning a blind eye to some of the improper expenditures there. What do you think about Gunderson's kind of honing in on this, and do you think that this is going to pay off for these kind of voters in this district?
I think it's only effective if, in the space of the minuscule amount of public attention people are going to pay to a state Senate district, he can effectively connect it to broader issues of her character. This is not something. Again, here's the curse of running as a small city mayor in a 1 million-person state Senate race is that voters don't know who you are and haven't been following the very small bore politics of Encinitas City Council. The blessing is that voters haven't been paying any attention to it, and so these scandals that might resonate with the 5,000 voters who are paying close attention to what happens in the Encinitas City Council, they may be paying attention. The other 995,000 people, this doesn't resonate in any way to the degree that abortion rights or gas prices, which are the Democrats and the Republicans' lead issue in this election, resonate. And so that's, I think, what both candidates can most effectively make their pitch on.
Sure. So it sounds like, from what I'm hearing from you, that focusing on what she's done as mayor is not going to be as effective with a larger electorate base and for District 38.
Yeah, unless there was a smoking gun scandal that voters can immediately, in the time that it takes them to get from their mailbox to their trash can, looking at the slick glossy mailer, fixate on. I don't see that, and so I don't think that moving beyond the talking points that have been the key ones for each party, that's going to be your longest and strongest suit for each candidate.
And what about going after her record as the chair of Sandag? Does that resonate with more voters, you think, or still not of interest?
I think Sandag has become, for a somewhat a hidden public agency that no one is directly elected to, it now is a name that resonates with some people, and those are mostly people who are already strongly on the Republican side, worried about the direction that Sandag is going to take about no longer building roads. But I think Sandag has not entered the greater political consciousness in a way that immediately it stands for corruption and an audit studies or audits that people are going to be worried about. And so I think it's hard to make a lot of political hay on for a candidate in a race like this.
Yeah, if you were to put a rough number on it, what percentage of San Diegans do you think even know what Sandag is and don't think it's a sandcastle building thing in Imperial Beach?
Yeah, exactly. Maybe you've seen that sign on the freeway and it's somewhat fallen into your consciousness. But this is really the sort of thing that people like us who like to sit around and have podcasts about politics follow closely. Most Californians, most San Diegans.
And compared to the taxi scandal, back in the 60s, this is nothing, what's going on. So what he said.
Sure. Carl, we'll start with you. We're going to shift topics a bit. So Congressional District 49, as we know, is going to be contested in this election as well. We have incumbent Mike Levin, the Democrat, who's holding the seat against challenger Republican Brian Maryott. Now, I ran across an interesting report last week that I don't know if you gentlemen have been familiar with, but this race was actually rated, to my surprise, as a toss-up by the Cook Political Report. Which was surprising to me because Levin really crushed the opposition in the primary. He's won the last two of these elections by convincing margins. So I'm curious to know, what's going on here? What factors, well, first of all, do you consider this report's results to be in line with your understanding of the race? But what factors could be pushing this race sort of into that toss-up area, sort of in Marriott's favor?
I was surprised that this race hasn't been a toss-up all along, right?
Yeah.
This race has been rated as a lean Democrat or a likely Democratic race, but I think, this is all the challenge for Mike Levin has always been defending this seat after a redistricting during a midterm in which his party is suffering and in the face of potentially a Republican wave, right? This is clearly the biggest challenge that he'll face. Republicans, knowing that, have invested in Brian Maryott. And if you looked at the results of the primary election, yes, Mike Levin's margin of victory over Brian Maryott was large, but he was held under 50%. Finished with about 49% of the vote. That's a warning sign for any incumbent. The rest of the vote was split primarily across Republican candidates, the others of whom were to the right of Brian Maryott. And where are those voters going to go? One, they're going to turn out in this election because overturning the House is at stake. And two, they're going to hold their nose at the rhino Brian Maryott and cast a vote for him and hope that helps swing the House massively towards the Republican Party. So I think Mike Levin has always faced a serious threat in this year.
Sure. Carl?
Yeah, Levin kind of reminds me of Brian Bilbray, Republican back in the 90s. He won in 96, won in 98, but because of Clinton impeachment, he doesn't win in 2000, the timing. It's that rule of three. If you're in the House, you win 3 elections, you're basically golden. You start filling out your retirement plans because you'll be there until you leave. If this had been one election cycle later, if Levin had been in for 3 terms, he'd have such a coalesced base, he'd have his money in place. Even with redistricting, he'd be the overwhelming favorite. But because of the timing, the redistricting, he's still weak. The party's in serious trouble. He's got a good chance that he's not going to win in this one. Oh, and again, his opponent, as I try to get the name, I always say his name wrong, Maryott. He is another squishy MAGA. I mean, he gives the right signals on abortion and stuff like, oh, I'm not going to be pursuing that. I want to talk inflation, the economy. But his base knows that if he wants them to stay with him, they're going to go back. He's got to go back in those positions. Once in the House, he will vote for a national ban on abortion when Republicans propose it when they take over the House. I don't think there's any doubt that they will put that through, and then it dies in the Senate. Or maybe not, because the filibuster in the Senate, if Republicans could control the Senate, I think has a very short shelf life.
Sure. That I want to turn to you. We talked about the 38th in terms of issues of abortion, of Blakespear's record. What do you think are the key issues at stake for voters in the congressional district? What are some of the issues that might swing the race either way, and how should the candidates play into that?
Yeah. So, to be the broken record, right? We're seeing in this in these campaign ads a lot of the focus on the same national talking points that we're seeing across the country and across San Diego for Democrats and Republicans. Mike Levin has been talking abortion for all these reasons that Carl was talking about, because he will be casting a vote on what could change the on the ground reality for Californians on reproductive rights over the next over the next generation. So that's a huge issue. And just as you're seeing Republicans across the country talking about gas prices and inflation, that's what you're hearing from Brian Maryott's side, and that resonates with voters where many of the voters who are in the purplish areas of this district, so areas like Oceanside, parts of Carlsbad, are not, Oceanside's not extremely wealthy. People are being crunched by gas prices and by inflation in a way that Del Mar voters may not be. So that's resonating in the swing parts of this district. That's a good issue for Brian Maryott. What Mike Levin's job has been to do, and he's really done this very explicitly over the last several years, is set out to find the crossover issues that help him appeal to the Republicans in San Clemente, in Mission Viejo, in Carlsbad. And a big part of that has been his positions on veterans issues. He's taken this strong leadership role. This is a military district. That helps him win crossover support. And San Onofre, right? Nuclear power. San Onofre is that. What do Democrats and Republicans in Orange County agree on? They agree on that they don't like San Onofre. And so he's found those crossover issues, as well as doing constituent service, that he's trying to use to insulate himself from the national political tides.
Sure. Carl?
Yeah, this is the question of whether or not that will work, given that I don't know how many Republicans are available to peel off in any race, particularly in San Diego County. And I believe that it was with Maryott that when the UT endorsed Levin, I think that was one of the things they took him on Maryott for was his stance on the border, that he made all kinds of pronouncements about immigration without ever even visiting the border, So they saw that as somewhat reckless within it. But that's rhetoric that appeals to the base. The idea that the horde is at the border pushing across. You don't particularly see that as you move that much farther up from the border, up the coast. But he's trying to make that a hot-button Republican issue.
Sure. I'm kind of hearing from you, Carl, with this race and the last one, that there's this sense of Republican challengers sort of keeping their connections to the MAGA movement, to Trump, kind of sort of on the low, while kind of pushing towards winning over the moderate center. Is that kind of
it's the
strategy?
old Monty Python routine of wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Yeah.
I mean, you've seen that. You see that in several of the Senate races across the country. But you see people across the country scrubbing their campaign websites to get rid of earlier statements on abortion and other issues. And for voters who didn't pay attention until sometime after I don't know, Columbus Day, Indigenous Peoples Day, that works because they don't see the long track record. And in a close race, those are the voters who could decide things.
Sure, absolutely. Any final thoughts on this race for either of you? Do you think Marriott's got a chance with this thing, or?
I think it's competitive. It's grown more competitive, just like the 38th Senate district between Blakespear and Gunderson that overlap with it. And where this political territory goes will tell us a whole lot about whether the Republican Party has a future in California. This area, right, this coastal strip of North County, San Diego, has been the area that's transformed the most in our political lifetimes. I mean, when I first started doing, radio shows with Carl and those things, this was solidly Republican area. If you thought about Carlsbad and Oceanside.
4-1 Republican to Democrat in the Congress.
Yeah, I mean, we had a Republican mayor, Republican 5-0 on the County Board of Supervisors. Right. So the party labels have dramatically changed. But the voters haven't changed that much, right? People don't change their opinions as much as in the way that party registration has changed. So what leads to this Senate district Democrats having a 6-point partisan registration edge is the national brand of the Republican Party has become too toxic under Donald Trump. People saw that and said, that's not me. They became independents. Some of them became Republicans. Some of the political officials, Nathan Fletcher, Brian Maryott, right, themselves flipped from the Republican to the Democratic Party, right? But those voters haven't drastically changed their positions. They're still driving SUVs and mad at payment at the pump. They're still worried about housing, these Republican issues that resonate. And so this is this chance for the Republican Party to show that if we can speak to voters with those values, we can overcome the toxicity of our political brand and retake this, what used to be a red heartland, and make it blue.
Sure, absolutely.
Sorry, vice versa. Yeah, make it red again. Sorry.
Sure. Carl, I want to turn to you about a slightly different race. So we have Assembly District 76. We have incumbent Brian Maryott, and then the challenger is Republican Christy Bruce Lane, who won the primary over her opponent June Cutter. So I'm interested, and either of you can start, but just sort of like who you guys think sort of, again, has the edge in this race, and sort of what's at stake for these voters.
Isn't redistricting fun? You know, seats that should basically be determined, you know, go up, and that's good in normal, you know, election cycles when you don't have such a clear, huge gap between the parties. Because one of the things Thad was saying, that voters haven't changed. I think they've changed in the following way. I think people's ids have become unchained, particularly since COVID. So thoughts that you might have had, but you kind of pat down and say, oh, I can't go there. Or you'd be like grandma and the kids say, Grandma, you can't say that. Now there's echo chambers where you can say it and you start to believe it. And I don't see the goodwill that you used to have between candidates before. I wonder in the Senate race and the congressional race, 49th, if it's really close and the Republicans lose, what happens down at the voter registrar's office? Are we going to see these sort of protests hitting San Diego? Because there's a huge movement right now to contest those things. But Manchin, again, he went the full cycle, you know, and Republican, Independent, Democrat. And it's a race that it shouldn't be up, but because of redistricting and Republicans having an advantage of the economy, which is actually much better than it seems. But in the short term, it looks bad. I feel like Jimmy Carter talking about a malaise. It's not as bad as you think. You know, that's how you get fired. It made the race more competitive. If I think Manchin's going to win, because he's got all the incumbent advantage to that, UT endorsement again, and all the rest with it. But the fact it's a race is in and of itself interesting.
Sure. What do you think? Republican challenger Christy Bruce Lane has a chance here, or how do you see this one playing out?
Yeah, look, she does, and the fact that we're talking about this, the fact that this is rated as a toss-up by most political observers, when Democrats have a 7-point registration edge, you know, that hasn't happened in the last decade. Races where the playing ground is so tilted towards the blue side, for Democrats to be threatened, especially a decade-long incumbent like Brian Maryott, that's indicative of perhaps where this election, where this wave is going. Election waves don't always come to California in the same way that they affect the nation. In 2010, we had this wave election where Barack Obama took his shellacking in his own terms in congressional races, in congressional seats, and I believe about 80 seats flipped nationally. It was a major loss, or maybe 60 seats. It was a major loss for the Democratic Party nationally. California, Democrats lost 0 congressional districts, 0 state Senate districts, and actually gained a seat in the state assembly. So California was detached from the national waves, whereas in prior elections, we'd been part of it. 1994, Republican Revolution, Newt Gingrich comes in, Republicans actually took control of the California State Assembly. So that we did move in the same way as the rest of the nation. This would be a big political test to see if Republicans gain ground in California, just as they're very, very likely to do nationally. And this is the kind of district that could flip with a big red tide.
Yeah, it could be indicative that the blue wave that roared through the beginning of the 21st century could start to recede in California. Or the other issue, though, is, again, rural counties versus the urban counties. Yeah, I wonder, you know, Texas already has the discussion about succeeding from the Union. I'm wondering when we get back to that big discussion in California about breaking up the state, if Republicans can't make the inroads they believe they're entitled to, and they'll accuse the Democrats of cheating to keep their majorities.
Sure. Thad, I want to turn to you. So something that's kind of been going on in this race is Christie has sort of labeled Brian as the invisible Brian Maryott. You know, he's not really, and I mean, I've experienced this sort of myself, but he's not really super engaged, dialed in with the media. He's not really, doing a lot of interviews, not a ton of campaigning even. He's sort of gone quiet a bit. And I'm just curious because there's kind of a pattern that I am sort of seeing regionally with this going on. Darrell Issa as well to the east has sort of adopted this strategy of, heavily favored incumbent, not super engaged with the media, not doing a lot of interviews, not a ton of aggressive campaigning. So do you think that this perception, you think that this plays for or against incumbents like Brian?
I'm not sure that this charge will resonate, but I do think it's indicative of kind of a problem with our overall political system, which is as California becomes both more bluer and bluer at the statewide level, but also as we become more segregated and polarized, each district becomes safer, right? You can't draw a competitive purple district in the East County, so Darrell Issa has a very safe red district. If you can't draw now, not just a San Diego or border district, but you can't draw a North County district that's all that competitive, and so it leads to safe incumbents often ducking debates, ducking the media. You see this with the controversy of Catherine Blakespear. Was she ducking debates? You see this with Gavin Newsom, who held one and only one debate with his Republican opponent, and guess when that was during? It was during NFL games and happened to be the Padres, the Padres El Fede playoff game. So there's not.
Wait. I watched that debate. No, wait a second. No, I didn't.
Yeah, I was about to say.
No, I didn't.
You should
That's
get
right.
an award as the only Californian who did.
No, I had to watch the Padres. Sorry as that was. But
right. So when it's not competitive and you're not diving into the media and social media, that everybody, both sides, suffer by not knowing who their representative, what their representative stands for, who their representative is, and that's a problem. As we not only have maybe a silent Brian Maryott, but a silent governor and a silent overall set of state politics. Let's get back to the Arnold Schwarzenegger days when everyone was paying attention.
Yeah, it was interesting. But yeah, the 2 points to follow up on that. One, I think it feeds into what I always look at as the Democratic conveyor belt. There's a sense in the California Democratic Party that you pay your dues, you spend time in an office at this level, and then when the person up here moves up, everybody moves up a level. And you just keep on going up. You got people who move from school board to city council, maybe board of supervisors, state assembly, then over to Congress, and if they have a chance, they'll go higher, otherwise stay in Congress forever. Juan Vargas down in the South Bay. And it's not necessarily giving you the best for policymaking because you just kind of get used to the fact you're going to have your job. And this redistricting was the second now done under the Citizens Redistricting Initiative that's supposed to make things more competitive. As Thad was saying, it's hard to do because people have voted with their feet. You go up to the People's Republic of Berkeley, California. If you're a Republican there, you didn't want to be part of the 20% of Republicans. You went through the tunnel to Walnut Creek. So it's Republican inland and it's Democrat on the coast. You've seen that around California and around the nation. And that's really dangerous because people don't even hang out in neighborhoods with the other members of the party. It's so much easier to demonize people you're never going to see. Sure. And that drives a lot of the id in modern politics.
The sense I'm getting, and correct me, either of you if I'm wrong, is that this is sort of being perceived as an intentional political strategy of once you reach a certain level of incumbent advantage, like sort of, ducking opposition, ignoring the media, kind of playing to, your strengths as an incumbent, and how this could be problematic for local elections. Is that fair assessment?
Look, you can only hurt yourself if you get involved in a debate and dive into these issues and are constantly there, as long as you're not trying to get to the next step on the conveyor belt, right? So that if you're trying to make a name for yourself, then you're the person who's tweeting a lot. You're the person who's chasing after the cameras, and going for it. But
that's Gavin Newsom. That was the debate. That was everything he did on the campaign. It's 2028 unless 2024. That should be his pin. We got Newsom 2028 unless 2024. Yeah, maybe.
Sure. You guys want to talk ballot measures or?
Sure. Although this is for the most expensive ballot direct democracy election in world history. it's awfully quiet and boring, right? It's sort of a snooze fest because we have some initiatives that are going to win by a lot, some initiatives that are going to lose by a lot, and not a lot that are driving conversations at the dinner table, other than, oh my God, I don't want to watch another Prop 27 ad.
Sure.
Yeah, what happened to like streaming services? Now I go on my freebie and I've got to sit through endless, when I'm watching a Quantum Leap, endless Prop 26, 27 ads, and the one about the medical one, Prop 29. No, I will bet, there's a pun in that people have tuned out on all of these.
So 26 and 27 both have to do with sort of expanding access to gambling at casinos, at racetracks, to online sports betting for Prop 27. I'm curious, so the recent polling that I looked at from the UC Berkeley Institute for Governmental Studies, it says that both of these initiatives are losing by fairly considerable amounts. And I didn't really know what to make of that. Why are these initiatives not gaining traction, in your view? And sort of also, if you have a second, just kind of touch on, who sort of stands to benefit and lose if these laws are enacted.
Yeah, so that's right. Poll after poll has shown that both Prop 26 and 27 are sort of in this interlocking death spiral where, especially because they've both been attacking each other a huge amount, that's driven down the negatives for both of these initiatives. Prop 26, the groups behind that are tribes, as well as horse racing tracks, places like Del Mar that would be open for the in-person gaming along with the main gaming tribes at tribal casinos throughout California. Prop 27, the gaming would be done online, so FanDuel's, DraftKings, out-of-state corporations, as you've heard over and over again, would benefit with a little bit of the money set aside for homelessness services, but I think it's very clear that that's not the reason that this is on the ballot. What does this mean? Should this be a shocker? At the end of the day, if you look back, before either of these initiatives had emerged, before either ran a single ad, positive or negative, Californians weren't very enthused about gambling on sports overall. Some of the Supreme Court allowed states to allow if they wanted to do so and regulate. It's something that most other states have done, and most people think it will happen someday in California. But Californians were not clamoring to do that. Maybe because we can just drive to Vegas if we want to do that sort of gaming. And so Californians had expanded gambling as part of a compact with tribes, right? A group who California government had not treated well and had a lot of public sympathy. That was the deal when California allowed gambling. It was to do it on tribal casinos. It was constrained geographically, and the benefits would go to a group that many people felt had gotten a raw deal from state government. Neither of these initiatives clearly made that compact, and I think that because of that reason, voters didn't get over their initial reluctance to expand gambling in California.
Sure, Carl.
Yeah, and as I seem to recall, when we were first putting through the gambling at Indian casinos back 20, 30 years ago, that went through years of being proposed, being shot down, getting in a certain number of slot machines, then voting to expand the slot machines. So it's always been a slow process because, as I was saying, people say, well, maybe we owe these people something, but on the flip side, we don't owe them that much. I mean, it's that the future of our indigenous residents is dependent upon the willingness of weekenders to go roll craps. It doesn't say a lot about us as a state and a nation for how we treat people, but be that as it may, I find it interesting. I believe both the San Diego Republican and Democratic parties have endorsed 26, opposed 27, but the one thing they could agree on, they're losing on it. The 26 is going to go down because confusion over 27, the morality issue, gambling is bad, unless you do it on the stock market with a hedge fund, and then it's considered, blessed. And the idea of out-of-state interests coming in. So I think 27 and 26 poison themselves. If they'd been smart, they would have made a deal to put the whole thing together as one package. But the issue is, of course, it competes between the two different venues. The homeless issue just ticks me off. You tap that on. I mean, you might as well run something that says, I'm going to have a proposition that allows open hunting on puppies, but we will give some money to the homeless from the revenues with the hope that that'll carry you over the top. Sure. If you want to address homelessness, do a massive $4, $6, $8 billion bond issue on homelessness, and you clean it up. The couple $100 million this would generate is not going to have an impact, but it looks good.
Sure. Okay. Well, while we still have time, I wanted to move to some of the research that both of you have been doing recently. I'll start with you, Carl. So something that you mentioned to me before our conversation earlier was that you've been doing research on a project measuring the intensity of political threats received by local elected office holders. and I have a copy here, but it's titled "How Scared Are You? Mapping the Threat Environment of San Diego's Elected Officials." So I like that this is local and that we can sort of talk about this in relation to some of our local races. But I want to know, so far from the research you've done, and I know this is still a work in progress, but sort of how you see this issue being on the rise and what trends or patterns are you observing in relation to threats at the political level?
All right, my Institute for Civil Civic Engagement partnered with I always be sure I get the Violence, Inequality, and Power Lab, the VIP lab at the Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice. We put in and received funding to do a study where we've sent a survey off to some 300 plus local board members, school boards, city councils, mayors, board of supervisors, and it's an anonymous study. We're not going to be tying people to actual responses, but we're trying to get a measure, and we're going to be using a scale to kind of come up with an intensity measure. Like this year, we were at a 3. Next year we're at a 2. Hey, it's getting better. Oh no, we're at a 4. It's not doing as well. There's nothing quite like that. The district attorney and the sheriff's office, they only get involved in threats to public officials when it crosses the line into criminality. They don't really have a good feel for what's happening underneath that. And will this stuff, you can see a correlation between criminal acts and general threats. Can this be something to help to warn what's happening? But also we're trying to see how it's impacting the willingness of people to serve in public office. I mean, there's lots of anecdotal and normative studies and nationally bridging divides. A national nonprofit has been looking at things like this at the national level. There's a strong body of evidence to suggest that the rising intensity of vitriol, of threats, of incivility that's directed at local officials are making people leave office earlier, not want to run for office in the first place, and cloud the policymaking space. You're so busy putting out all of the negative, you don't have time to really move on the positive. What we've seen just locally in our own board of supervisors. So this is a first stab on our part to get some data together, both empirically and normatively, the values, what are people feeling coming out of this, to try to get a handle on what's happening in San Diego. Sure. My hope is it's a big nothing burger. It turns out it really isn't as bad as we think. It's not having an impact. My fear is it's having a significant impact.
Sure. Do you feel like the impact also has to not just do with discouraging certain people from running for office, but it has an impact on maybe who does decide to run for office? Is that something you've explored so far?
Well, we have not yet from our data been able to determine that, but hopefully from the survey responses we may have some evidence to back that up one way or another. Anecdotally, you can just look around at the school board races, not just nationally, but just here in San Diego County, and you have a lot more vitriol that's showing up at school board meetings, but in the races, these have coalesced into groups of people running for office and school boards advancing one very different policy position than those who might be on the board, like critical race theory supporters versus opponents get tied up with COVID response who said you should have masks and inoculations. And then there are people who said you shouldn't be having to mask my kids. You see clear distinctions between the people that are running. And what we really would like to hear is what are people on both sides of the political spectrum receiving? I think part of the narrative is progressives getting all this hate mail from conservatives, but I'm betting, and we're already seeing some evidence of that, that conservatives are getting it as well from progressives. The question is it equal? Or is there a decided difference between them? Sure. I mean, with the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband, it's just another data point along the way. Yeah. We got to figure this out. It's all fun and games before somebody stabs somebody in the eye with scissors while running.
Yeah. So that's awesome. So I'm looking forward to reading this at least. How and when will this be available for the
gathering public? Data now? We should be looking to do follow-up interviews with some of the recipients December, January, and then we're partnering with the San Diego Union Tribune to help disseminate some of our results and do some community forums in the spring to bring people together to talk about, hey, this is where we're at. Are you happy with that? If not, what can we do to make it better? Sure. You've already seen at the state level changes to the Brown Act and open meeting laws, how people just discuss things in open meeting. Maybe we'll get some recommendations for even better ways to do public discourse. I mean, people don't run for school board to look out their window and see people defacing their cars.
Sure, fair enough. All right, well, I'm looking forward to that. And then, Thad, you have some research as well. You just recently published a paper titled "Are Elite Cues Necessary to Drive the Winner Effect on Trust in Elections?" And I read part of this paper. Admittedly, I didn't read the whole thing yet, but I'm looking forward to it. And you sort of talk about the loss of faith at some level for the losing side in an election in the legitimacy of results. And you're looking at this, correct me if I'm wrong, on a national level. So I want to know, like, in the paper, and you sort of explained to people what your findings were, but what trends you found and how these trends trouble you or otherwise. And sort of maybe just first of all explain what the winner effect is and how that's evolved in our political system.
Yeah, well, thanks, and thanks for taking the time to talk about these issues, which I see is really intertwined with the important work that Carl and his collaborators are doing, because this is, we can talk about each of these races, and that's important, especially to all those candidates, but I think the five-alarm fire in American democracy right now is the decrease in faith in our elections, and then what happens after that, right? So if you don't trust the election results, then you're going to be more likely to threaten an election official to contest that election, and that's what we're seeing, and really I think we're still at this point in America where we don't know where the next few years will take us in terms of pulling further apart or coming together around our institutions. One of the things that we know from history of American elections and study of elections all around the world is that nothing makes you trust elections like winning them, which may be one of the roots back that might bring us together if there really is a flip in this election contest. And nothing makes you distrust them like losing elections. And so there have been these studies that have looked sort of a month before and a month after elections, and seeing that the winning side becomes more trusting. And one thing we didn't know the answer to is, well, is that about people hearing from a sore loser and that there was fraud and then following that a leader's cue, or is it about just you immediately, your mood changes, you individually, without being led to it, come to the conclusion that the election wasn't fair, that the institutions aren't legitimate if your side loses. To test this, we did this at the state level in California with the Yankelovich survey during the recall election. We're working with, we're about to put into place 5 polls looking at trust in the national election and the midterms, where we're working with nonpartisan election officials in 5 states across the country. But in this study, we did 2 mirror image survey samples the 2 days before the recall election, leading up to 8 o'clock when polls closed on election day, and then reopened the survey and ran another survey right after people knew that the recall had been defeated, and the candidates leading the recall, especially Larry Elder, did not contest that. He didn't make a claim of fraud. So without any leadership cue, did just people on their own change their mind? Absolutely. There are these massive, more than 10-point effects where Republicans became less trusting and Democrats more trusting of the election. What's going to happen with the midterm elections? Right now, Republicans are the party that doesn't trust elections nationally, and Democrats do. That's a big switch that happened right after the 2020 election, where before that, there's no difference. If Republicans win, will they come back to trusting elections after this midterm, or will all of the elite rhetoric, will everything that we've seen over the past 2 years in unfounded allegations against election officials, will that have already poisoned the well so much that there's no longer a reservoir of trust?
Sure. And do we see the winner effect play out across both parties, or has this been largely a response by the Republican side? Yeah,
it's been a symmetric, in past studies across U.S. history, across different countries, it's been a symmetric effect on the left and right? It hasn't been characteristic of only the right to not trust elections. Democrats have either gained or lost trust in elections, though not to the extent, I want to be clear, we haven't seen really any party in recent American history sort of broadly distrust and make the kind of accusations that we've seen with the Republican Party over the last 2 years.
Sure.
Since the presidential election.
So I want to talk a bit about, blowing this up a bit, is this phenomenon that you're seeing, that you're studying, from what you can tell, is this unique to the U.S.? I mean, is this something that when you study other emerging democracies or other established democracies, do we see similar shifts and similar trends? I don't know if you've looked at that at all, but sort of just and also how is this concerning from that sort of bigger perspective?
Yeah, so past scholars have done exactly these sorts of studies in all the Western European democracies, found the same kind of winner effect. Then they did them in the emerging democracies of Southern Europe and Latin America, found the same effect. We've seen allegations of vote fraud, right? AMLO, before he became president in Mexico, had lost elections and claimed fraud. We're all on our knife's edge to see what will happen in Brazil, whether President Bolsonaro, right, will claim fraud. So this is not a distinctly American phenomenon. It's really, in some ways, it's America realizing that it has a lot in common with the rest of the world, that trust in American democracy, that respect for our institutions is not a given. And just as we've seen it erode and we've seen democratic backsliding in other countries, we may potentially see that in America, and we can learn lessons from the rest of the world.
But for those who haven't read the paper yet, I mean, what's, like in America specifically, like what's the essence of the theory that you postulate as to why voters in our system on the losing side are having less and less faith in election results? I mean, can we point towards a specific point in time and say this is kind of where it started, or like what's behind that?
Yeah, so this study, I don't want to get beyond the data of this study. This study looks at one sharp moment in time and shows that in less than 24 hours, voters can, to a large degree, change their mind about whether elections are free and fair in America. And I think that points out some of the fragility of our democracy. What have we seen as a long-term trend? Well, really the sort of sustained efforts by the Republican Party to, after having their day in court, right? Having the chance to produce evidence of voter fraud and then not producing that, to then taking those charges unevidenced and bringing them forth on social media and campaigns across the country. That steady drumbeat has driven this lack of faith in American institutions on the part of one party in a way that has created, in the words of MIT scholar Charles Stewart, who's one of the sort of, who's been studying this for a long time, we saw basically a political earthquake after the 22 election that drove this huge fault line between the Democrats and Republicans on trust that was unlike anything that we'd seen in recent polling history.
Sure. Carl, do you have any thoughts on Thad's research?
What Thad's looking at is the critical moment in American democracy. If you don't trust elections to resolve our disputes, what do you have left? And what you have left is some form of an authoritarian system. Somebody with power resolves it. Bolsonaro, maybe there's a military coup. We don't want to see that here. Oh, the other way you resolve it is you just guarantee your side doesn't lose. I mean, I was disturbed back in the 90s when you saw it more on the Republican side. Indeed, they came up with the idea, and Democrats kind of mimicked the quest for the permanent majority. We always want to be in charge because we can't trust the other side. The Clinton election in the 90s made a lot of Republicans go, how can a man like that win? Something was wrong. In the 2004, 8, and 12 elections, a local guy, Mark Larson, who used to be on AM Talk, maybe he still is, he'd always say around the election time, we need to get out the vote. We have to win by so much they can't steal it. And that became a national expression in 2008, 2012. It's kind of worked its way into the zeitgeist that the other side's trying to steal the election. I mean, Bush v. Gore added to that on the Democratic side, but Democrats kind of sucked it up after that and then tried to win in 2004. Thank you for nominating John Kerry, and then won the next couple of elections. I begin to wonder if after this midterm going into 2024, how much goodwill will be left for anybody to be able to trust elections. Though it is interesting to me when Republicans, you'd say when you win, you should trust them more. It was odd that in 2016, Republicans did great. Statewide, in congressional races, governorships. And right now, Republicans do very well at the state level. They still don't trust elections as much as Democrats trust them.
But after 2016, they did. Like, there was no divide between Republicans and Democrats on trust in election until the 2020 election.
The 2020 blew it up.
That's what blew it off. Even though there were charges by Donald Trump that there are 4 million people who voted in California illegally, people didn't fixate on those. Because
you won.
They won, right? They were focused
and
on
Republicans still did very well at the state level in 2020. Somehow the Democrats are too dumb to steal those votes while they're stealing the big ticket votes. Sure. Steal a couple of county assessor votes, Democrats. Come on.
Don't joke about this.
I know. I know.
Well, now you both have to go soon. So what, any of the issues we've talked about or anything we didn't touch on, final thoughts, Thad, just on the upcoming election, specifically in our county and any of the ballot measures, anything?
Look, if the polls can be trusted, and I think they can, I think we're going to see a major Republican wave at the national level. And so the real questions are, is California going to be like a bellwether state that moves with that wave, or are we going to retain our political independence that we've really declared over the last decade that's insulated us from that? And that will say a lot about the future of the Republican Party, right? If the Republicans can't win with gas prices this high, with Joe Biden this unpopular, if they can't start making inroads in some of these blue districts that used to be deep red in San Diego, then I think we're going to be talking about a permanent majority of Democrats in California.
Which isn't good for democracy.
Nope.
You need that nice competition between moderates who can reach to the center. Yeah, I agree with that. What we'll probably see here is a ripple effect of that wave. The Democrats might lose a few races they shouldn't. My question is, even with that, while people are supposed to accept that, if they win, their support for elections go up. Republicans win a few, it might go up. I'm wondering how much election denialism will play out even here, protests after the fact, as a run-up to 2024. Mm-hmm. You're seeing in other states, people with weapons outside of ballot drop places. Mm-hmm. Not seeing that in San Diego. I think we're saved by the beach. The weather's too nice to become that politically involved. But when you go inland, we have a substantial, very alt-right population, small but very focused. I'm hoping they'll just stay quiet through this cycle, but I don't know how long they'll stay quiet.
Sure. Well, appreciate you both coming on. Just one more reminder for those of you tuning in. Professor Carl Luna is currently doing research on the issue of election threats against officials. How scared are you? Mapping the threat environment of San Diego's elected officials, and that'll be available, I believe, next calendar year. And then we have Dr. Thad Kassler, who came on, and he's just published a paper, Are Elite Cues Necessary to Drive the Winner Effect on Trust in Elections? So please give that paper a read if you haven't. But thanks to both of you for coming on. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. This has been another episode of Stay Classy San Diego with your host, Steve Wire. Thanks again to our sponsors, Max Lux Media at maxluxmedia.com and Barntime Productions at barntimemusic.com. And thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in and viewing the show. We'll see you next time. Stay classy, San Diego.